All right, we're on Unit 3 now, using relative clauses. So we already talked about independent clauses, dependent clauses, phrases, sentence fragments. Now we're going to talk about relative clauses. So we're adding on. A relative clause is one kind of dependent clause. So we've talked about that before. It has a subject and a verb, but it can't stand alone as a sentence. A relative clause will always begin with a relative pronoun. So you need to know these words: who, whom, whose, that, and which. So let's look at how the relative clauses below are used to combine two sentences. I like the person spoke to me on the subway. Great. Instead of saying that, we might want to use a relative clause by combining our two sentences with the word who. I like the person who spoke to me on the subway. This combines the two sentences and also makes a complex sentence. You could do it again with a different word. I dislike the cat killed my pet hamster. You could say, I dislike the cat that killed my pet hamster. Notice when we talk about a person, we use who, but when we talk about an animal, we use that. Then we have, I am moving to Grand Rapids, Michigan. It is the hometown of Floyd Mayweather, who is apparently a boxer, if you don't know. My husband told me. You can say, I am moving to Grand Rapids, Michigan, comma, which is the hometown of Floyd Mayweather. So here we add in the which. Let's talk a little bit about the punctuation and when we need to use a comma with these relative pronouns and when you don't. So a relative clause is always going to begin with the relative pronoun. If you think about those dependent words with a woobus, it's the same idea here. This one we don't have a nice acronym though. So we have who, which is used for people, whom, used for people, whose, shows possession, like who owns something, that, which is people or things, more likely things, and then which is always used with things. So who, subjects, people performing the action, names, pronouns, which are like he, she, they. Whom, objects, people receiving the action, and we'll talk a little bit more about when to use who and when to use whom. Names or pronouns like him, her, them. I always tell students if you can use a him or them, then you need to use a whom. That's my little mnemonic device for remembering. Whose, you have possession or pronouns like his, hers, ours, or theirs. That is only used in essential or restrictive clauses. Make sure you highlight this. Never, ever set off with commas. So that is just never has a comma, ever. And then we have which are subjects or objects. And yet this is used in non-restrictive clauses. We'll talk about what that means. And that always, always, always has a comma. How I remember this is a which, oh, there's the bell. We'll wait a second. Okay. A which always has a crooked nose, like a comma. I don't know. Maybe it'll help, maybe not. So let's talk about what it means here with these essential and restrictive clauses. Essential or restrictive relative clauses, give information that is needed to define the noun. So you never ever use commas to set off an essential clause. So that means that you need that information in order for the sentence to make sense. It's essential. You must have it. Like essential, like you must have water and shelter in order to live. So I like the sculptures that are in front of Warrior Hall. If I just said, I like the sculptures, you'd be like, what sculptures? What are you talking about? When you define it, that are in front of Warrior Hall, I know exactly what you mean. That's why it's essential, because you must have this in order for the first part of your sentence to make sense. And then I have students who complete all of their work will pass the class. Again, I couldn't just say students will pass the class. You'd be like, what students? Who would pass the class? The ones who complete all their work. Then you have, I hope to hear from the girl whom I spoke with last night, or I hope to hear from the girl with whom I spoke last night. Either one is fine, whether you put the with in front or you put the with after, either one makes sense. Then we have these non-restrictive or non-essential relative clauses. These ones mean that we don't need that part of the sentence in order for it to make sense. So you could say, my brother, who teaches at Granville High School, is an avid hunter and fisherman. Now, teaching at Granville High School has nothing to do with being an avid hunter or fisherman, but maybe later on in the paragraph, the author is going to talk about that, so maybe you want that information. But for the sentence to make sense, you don't need this. You could pull that out completely and it would still make sense. So notice when we pull something out completely, you have commas on either side. Because your complete sentence is, my brother is an avid hunter and fisherman. That makes sense. But we're going to add more information, an interrupter, which is that non-restrictive, non-essential clause offset by commas. Then we have, I am planning on growing broccoli, comma, which I find quite delicious. That's great, you find it delicious, but I don't need to know that in order for me to understand that you're planning on growing it. So that's added information, so we use the comma, which. Then we have Steve is teaching Sunday school, a Sunday school class with 4 and 5-year-olds, comma, which can be quite demanding. True, 4 and 5-year-olds can be. But again, that doesn't need to be there in order for the rest of the sentence to make sense. So it is non-essential, non-restrictive relative clause. Okay, lots of information, and this one is tricky, so if you feel like, hey, I'm having a hard time, yeah, you probably are, and that's okay. But let's go through these ones here together, and then you guys can do some on your own, and you can check and see how you're doing with the answer key. So we're supposed to identify whether each boldface clause is essential or non-essential. If the clause is non-essential, insert commas where needed. So Gary, who won the spelling bee, became the first one in our class to receive an award. Okay, we have the word who, which means that it could be restrictive or non, we don't know. So what I do is I like to take this out and see if the sentence makes sense without it. Gary became the first one in our class to receive an award. What award? Why did he receive it? Oh, because he won the spelling bee. So that one would be essential because I need to know the spelling bee in order for the award. Here I have John's wrist, which he broke last fall, is still too weak for him to throw discus. Now this one has the word which is a special case. And if we go up and look at our packet here, which always set off with comma. No matter what, it always is, that's the rule. So I can go back down and I would insert my commas here and here. And I would say it is non-essential. It means I could pull it out. And then we have few stockbrokers who claim to be able to navigate the market can actually do so. Few stockbrokers can actually do so. That doesn't make sense. So we would have to have this information who claim, which means no commas, which means it is essential. Then we have, were Mr. Stark's directions, which seem rush, understandable to the class? Again, we have which, so we automatically know there is a comma by our rule, which means it is non-essential. And then lastly, we have the home that was destroyed in the fire belonged to Reverend Hisroth. This is another one that has a rule, has the word that. If we look up here, that never set off with commas we have highlighted. So this one is going to be essential simply by fact that it's using that. Like I said, this unit is harder. There's a lot going on. Up here at the top, it gives you that information again. Fill in the relative clause words, which are up here in your boxes, relative pronouns. Then you'll be writing some of your own sentences. Again, make sure you check the example sentences. And then at the very bottom, you'll be looking for the best example. Okay, so go through this, make sure you're spending time doing it, and then of course always check it with the answer key or with your teacher.